Radio, and right now it is my great privilege to welcome on the Retro Radio Hotline, Eric Carmen. Eric, thank you very much for joining me today. It is a great privilege to have you here on Retro Radio.
Well, thank you.
You have a new song called Brand New Year that's available on the new CD compilation, Essential Eric Carmen. And I do want to ask you more about the song, but I first wanted to ask you about the opening track on that compilation, a song from your days with Cyrus Erie called Get the Message. And believe it or not, I've played the original single several times in the show, and it is occasionally requested.
Amazing.
But you weren't happy with it back then. Why is that?
Oh, well, it's not so much that I wasn't happy with it back then. It's that, we had Cyrus Erie, I think all of us were 18 or when we went into that studio. And it was our first real, my first real professional recording experience. We were signed to Epic Records in New York and recorded at Columbia Studio C. We were walking in as Simon and Garfunkel were packing up their stuff and walking out. And it was obviously a pretty thrilling experience, and we had these two producers, Sandy Linzer and Mike Petrillo, who had both written songs. They'd written a couple of things for the Four Seasons. They were heavily into the Four Seasons, and they had listened to all of the songs that I had brought up and some songs that Wally had brought up to New York. We sat in Sandy's office, and he said, "Play me something," So we just started playing, and the four of us were there, and they got excited about some of my stuff. About 5 songs in, they were kind of yelling, "The kid's a young Bob Gaudio." I was thinking, who's Bob Gaudio? I was only familiar with Lennon, McCartney, and Brian Wilson, and Mick and Keith at that point. It was like, Bob Gaudio, who's that? Turns out he was the main songwriter of the Four Seasons, who co-wrote all their hits, and a very talented guy. But to me, it was like, what? In any case, we finished playing Sparrow, I think, which they loved, and I remember Mike Petrillo saying, it'll be great. We'll put a gallop guitar on it and an organ and a fuzz tone. Speed it up. It'll be perfect. And I was thinking, wow. In that one sentence, he named like 4 things that I would hate, just one after another. Hate organ, hate fuzz tone, gallop guitar. Are you kidding? And we'll speed it up. It was kind of a pretty Bee Gees style ballad at the time. And we got into the studio, and it was just like a circus in there. I can't even begin to describe the silly things that these guys wanted us to do. And I don't know if you've ever heard the actual recording of Sparrow, but it is so horrible. I actually just heard it the other day somewhere, and when I heard it, it just they completely destroyed it, to say the least. And so we literally spent, I think they spent $90,000 in 1968 money. I can't even imagine what that would be today. Basically destroying 2 of my better songs. And we didn't know enough to be able to say, no, you can't do that. That sucks. We're not going to play that way. We just did what they told us to do. And so they pretty much destroyed these things. And then at some point I was sitting out in the studio at the piano, and Mike Petrillo came out to me, and he walked up and he said, hey, what's your worst song? And I said, why? And he said, well, we got to have something for the B-side. And I said, well, why would you want to put my worst song on the B-side? And he said, well, we don't want anybody to get confused and flip the record and play over and play the other side. So we want it to suck. And I said, yeah, I seem to recall Penny Lane on one side, Strawberry Fields Forever on the other side. Back in the days of 45 RPM records. And, those were 2 pretty darn good songs. Why not give the fans 2 good songs? No. We don't want to do that. So, sensing where the whole thing was going, I was sitting there at the piano, and I knew that Get the Message was basically kind of a Who-type song with guitar. And I thought I could probably make that sound pretty bad playing it on the piano. And so I played him about half of Get the Message, and halfway through he said, yeah, that's great, that sucks. And the next day we recorded it, and I believe we did 2 takes. That was it. And when I asked them if I could put a rhythm guitar on it, they said no. So it was 1 guitar, bass, drums, and some vocals, and I think we added a little percussion, and that was the end of it. And I remember that when they released the record, and Sparrow was the A side, and 2 weeks later it flipped nationally. Everybody started playing the other side, which was the 1 take side that we spent no money or time on. But they didn't mess with that one. they let our arrangement be the arrangement, because they didn't care about that one. They weren't going to improve on it. So that's pretty much why it ended up the A side. Taught me a lot about producers right then and there.
Eric Carmen joins me on the Retro Radio Hotline as he talks about his days with Cyrus Erie. The song Get the Message is available on the new CD, The Essential Eric Carmen. First time it's ever been released on CD. Please tell us about the remastering process for that song, Get the Message.
When Tim Smith, producer of this compilation, brought up Get the Message, my recollection was that it sounded pretty thin back in the old days, and I hadn't heard it in, decades. But since it was on Epic, and Epic is part of Sony now, Tim dug the original master, 2-track master, out of the vaults, and when Mark Wilder, our genius remastering engineer, converted all the original analog master tapes to digital, then we could actually get in there and make it better. So it was actually the very first song that we worked on the first day of remastering. And Mark, pulled it up, and he's got his little computer with an oscilloscope, and he's got all this vintage gear from Neve and Trident and whatever all surrounding him, and he starts to work his magic for about 15 or 20 minutes, and he turns around and looks at me and says, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, the guitars sound great now, and it definitely sounds better." And I was watching what he was doing, and I said, do you think we could get away with adding a couple of decibels at 100 cycles, make that kick drum punch me in the chest? And he said, "Yeah, I think we could do that." So he adds a couple of decibels, and all of a sudden the kick drums, boom, there it is. Great. And then I said, do you think now we could add some maybe 50, 60 cycles to the bass, make that sound a little rounder and fuller? He said, "Yeah, we can do that." He adds a couple of decibels. Wow, the bass sounds better. And then finally I said, "Is there some frequency you could add to my voice, make me sound perhaps a little less prepubescent?" And he said, yeah. And he added a couple of dBs in somewhere. And lo and behold, by the time we got done, 45 minutes later, a track that I thought I was going to be embarrassed by, I thought, actually, it's pretty cool now. And I'm happy that it's there. So I didn't hate it back then. It's just way better now, because technology has allowed us to make it sound the way it should have back in 1968.
Incredible. And you didn't add anything to it. You didn't add any new instrumentation to it.
No.
All from the original tapes.
We didn't remix anything. We didn't add anything to anything. We were working from the original flat 2-track master tapes. All we did is Mark converted them very carefully and in high quality to digital.
Let's hear that final result now. This is the remastered version of Get the Message. Eric Carmen with Cyrus Erie from 1968. That's Cyrus Erie with the remastered version of Get the Message that's featured on the new compilation CD, The Essential Eric Carmen. I'm Jumpin Joe Madigan, and joining me on the Retro Radio Hotline is Eric Carmen. Now, Eric, Cyrus Erie featured some of the original members of the choir, including Wally Bryson. Did you have any involvement with the choir previously, and was Cyrus Erie an attempt to rival them?
Yes. The story of how Wally ended up in Cyrus Erie was in high school. I played in a band that was, we did lots of debutante parties and all that sort of stuff. And I ran into this other band called the Rebel Kind, and their lead singer and kind of leader of the band was a guy named Kenny Margolis. And we were non-union, they were union, and as a result of that, they played certain gigs with the choir. Well, Kenny's band broke up right about the same time mine did, and I had this idea that, maybe Kenny and I should team up. We'd have two keyboard players, both lead singers. We could start with that as the nucleus, and I talked to him about it. He said, great idea. He brought his drummer from his old band. I brought my guitar player from my old band. Eventually, we added a girl singer to the group, and we practiced down in the basement of Angela Marco. The drummer's dad owned a beauty shop right up at Cedar and Warrensville, and we practiced in the basement of the beauty shop after hours. And after about 3 months, we were actually getting pretty good. The band was sounding good. We were on the verge of being ready to go out and book some gigs and whatever. In the meantime, I had gone to see the choir. They played, I think, at the Chagrin Armory one night, and I'd heard we'd heard this buzz that they had this unbelievable bass player called the Squire, and there was a guy named Dave Burke, and I initially went to say, I gotta go see how great this guy can be, and lo and behold, he was absolutely terrific, but the whole band was terrific, and I saw Wally up there on stage, and I thought, man, if I could get the band with that guy, we could do some serious damage. And the choir were kind of my heroes. I looked at them like they were the Beatles, and they had at that point a number one record in Cleveland called "It's Cold Outside," and it was made the top 40 nationally. It looked like they were going places, and plus they were just really cool. And so, knowing that I really admired these guys, Kenny would come into rehearsal and he would tell me these stories about them because he'd played with them, and he would tell me what morons they were and hillbillies and on and on and on, and I was like, get out of here! They can't be, these guys are my heroes, And he would go on and on because he enjoyed bursting my bubble. And so one day after 3 months, I walk into rehearsal, and Kenny's packing up his gear. And I said, what are you doing? And he goes, joining the choir. I said, what? The hillbillies and morons that you've been talking about for 3 months? And he goes, it's just business. And that was that. He packed up his gear and walked out, and that was the end of it. And I was mad. We just wasted 3 months. And I thought, if anybody should be joining the choir, it should be me. I'm a better fit for that band than Kenny is. He had a lower voice. He kind of played keyboards with one hand and held the mic with the other. I think he was self-taught. And so in one of the boldest moves I've ever made, because I was extremely shy back then, I got a hold of some girl that I knew that she knew the band and their manager and whatever. And I asked her if she could get me their manager's phone number. And she did, and I called him up. His name was Ray Taylor, and I called him on the phone, and I said, Ray, I'm not very good at shameless self-promotion, but, I'm going to have to tell you the truth here. I think before you make your final decision about getting Kenny in the choir, you should give me an audition. It's all I want. And I said, I can play keyboards, I can play guitar, I can play drums, I write, and I sing. And I think I'm a better fit for your band. And so he said, well, I'll tell you what, we're playing out in, I don't know, Lorraine Hullabaloo or something. And this is probably like 1967, maybe. 67. And he said, why don't you come out and we'll let you audition. So I drove out there, and at some point in the evening, I ended up talking to all the guys in the band. And I kept waiting for somebody to say, okay, well, there's a piano back there. We're done. Let's go hear you play or something. And it just didn't happen. So at some point, I just got in the car and drove home. Never got the audition. And they took Kenny in the band, and that was that. And I kind of walked away from that and said, darn. I said, well, 6 months from now, I'm going to have the best band in the city, and they're going to be sorry. And as luck would have it, I was going to college, and some guy that I played in my high school band was in a class with the manager of Cyrus Erie. And Cyrus Erie already existed, and they were looking for a drummer so that they could bring their drummer, Michael McBride, out front. And Mike did a pretty seriously good Mick Jagger impersonation, and so they just wanted to, find a guy who could sit back on drums and play Charlie Watts. And I thought I could probably do that. So I went and auditioned as the drummer and got the job. And I don't know, to make a long story short, I brought in my friend Marty, same guitar player who I'd been working with, was my best friend, and they booted their rhythm guitar player, and their lead guitar player was on vacation at the time, and we just kind of worked as the four of us with Mike out front. And we had a gig at the Agora, I think it was on New Year's Eve of 60, maybe 8. 68 to 69 or something. And the guitar player, who was incensed that his friend, the rhythm player, had been tossed out of the band while he was on vacation, decided he was going to show us. And so he showed up at the Agora, but he just stood back in the crowd. We never came backstage, and he just figured we'd get up there and crash and burn, and he would have the last laugh. So we got out, we were sitting backstage and waiting, and this guitar player, his name was Tim, he just didn't show up. And finally we had to go play. And so, but we had no lead guitar player, and so at some point I told the band, my friend Marty already knew, but I said, I can actually play guitar, and if we put me on guitar and Mike goes back on drums, we might be able to get through this. And so that's pretty much what we did. We walked out on stage and we just kind of winged it. And we made it through the gig, and that was the beginning of the new Cyrus Erie. And the band became pretty popular over a period of months, and Wally had, I guess, just gotten thrown out of the choir, along with Dave Burke, and he came to see Cyrus Erie at Mentor Hullabaloo one night when we were playing. And after the show, he walked up to me and he said, "You were right. We should have got you." And I felt pretty happy about that. And I went home and called the guys in the band, and I said, "What do you think? Should we ask them to join?" And they said, "Sure." So I called Wally the next day, and I said, "You want to join our band?" And he said, "Sure." And the new Cyrus Erie was born. And that was eventually Marty Murphy left the band, and as a foursome, that's how we ended up with Epic Records and that's the band that made that record.
Now, how did Cyrus Erie evolve into The Quick? And by the way, Ain't Nothing Gonna Stop Me is a killer record.
God, I hate it.
Really?
I did everything I could to keep it off this record. Tim was going to put it on there, and I listened to it, and I said, Tim, this can't go on the record. It's so embarrassing. During that period of time, there was this just group of musicians in town. You had the James Gang, and you had Cyrus Erie, and you had the choir, and there were a lot of kind of good musicians between those bands, and every so often there'd be a shake-up somewhere, and someone would steal a member from one of the other bands, and the band who had just lost a member would steal another member from one of the other bands again, and so it was this constant kind of like evolving thing going on. And at some point, Danny Klawan, who had been in the original choir, he was a drummer and also a bass player. And I thought he was talented. He's the guy who wrote It's Cold Outside, and pretty talented guy. And Cyrus Erie had broken up, and so I approached Danny and I said, want to make a band? And he said, sure. And we got his younger brother Randy played guitar, and Mike McBride, and at that point we were kind of moving on toward Led Zeppelin and Spooky Tooth and a little bit heavier stuff. But overall, the band I don't think was very good. we had our moments, but I don't recall a lot of gigs where I ever thought, gee, we really did great tonight. It just didn't quite gel, and so that's how that happened. And as quickly as the band came together, there was a moment in time where Danny and I were writing together, and he had only interest in writing rock songs. He didn't want anything to do with any kind of a ballad, period. And so I said, well, that kind of limits us a little bit, you know. I mean, the Beatles wrote rock and roll songs, and they wrote ballads, and even the Rolling Stones play ballads, you know. How did you say no ballads ever? And he said no ballads ever, and that was pretty much the end of that band. So we moved on from there. I think Cyrus Erie ended up getting back together for about a minute, and then at some point, Cyrus Erie had broken up, and there had been like 19 different versions of the choir. And I remember going down to DePoo's in the Flats and watching the choir's last gig, and the choir at that point was very, very different. They had Phil G. Lombardo, who was an organ player. They were playing a lot of Procol Harum and all kinds of other stuff. They had moved far away from the original sort of Beatles, Byrds, Rolling Stones, Hollies kind of original choir. And it was their last night, and I went up to talk to Jim Von Fanny, who I'd always liked the way he played drums. And I said, are you interested in starting a new band? And he said, nope, I'm hanging it up. I'm going to go out and play golf. I've had enough. I don't want to think about bands. I don't want to be in a band. He had kind of reached the end of his rope. And I said, well, if you change your mind, give me a call. And about 3 months later, Jim called me up and he said, let's make a band. And I said, okay. And so went over, I remember I sat in Jim's apartment, and we talked about what we wanted to do. You know, I had ideas for a band that would play, music that was, had power guitars like The Who, but would incorporate melodies and harmonies like the Beatles and the Left Bank and the Beach Boys, and some combination of those things with great songwriting. I really hated progressive rock. It was about 1970, and Jethro Tull was all over the airwaves, and I mean, there's a band called Hot Tuna, which was just the worst noise I've ever heard. It was one of the, I think, the guitar player from the Jefferson Airplane, and some electric fiddle player named Papa John Creech. And I remember hearing some 7-minute thing on WMMS and thinking, why would anyone ever want to make this sound? I just thought it was horrible. And we had moved away from the, I guess I look back at the 60s, and I think that was the era of songwriting being the most important thing. The Beatles were really all about songs. You had the Beach Boys, Brian Wilson's brilliant songwriting, Burt Bacharach, Holland Dozier and Holland writing all these great Motown hits, Marvin Gaye, Carole King and Jerry Goffin writing tons of hits for everybody. And the music of the 60s was really about hit records. It was about, great 3 minutes songs. And by the time 1970 rolled around, I call it, we had moved into this phase that I call the age of technicians. I've heard Eric Clapton play, a jillion songs, and as good as he is technically, the guy has never, ever played a note that ever made me say, wow, I love that. I know he's good. I can listen to him. I actually played with Jack Bruce, his bass player, in Cream. He was an amazing musician. But Clapton never moved me. And this whole business of just long, extended solos. And at that point, everybody who played a guitar, Jeff Beck, there's no question that he's maybe the greatest guitar player alive. Jimmy Page, Eric Clapton. But, I just saw Jeff when I went to see Brian Wilson months ago, back in November or October. He came, the Brian Wilson Jeff Beck tour, came to E.J. Thomas Hall in Akron, and I went to say hi to the guys in Brian's band who were friends of mine. And I went out and listened to Jeff, who had his own band. He played after Brian's set. And they didn't have a singer, and no matter how great a guitar player Jeff is, and he is, as phenomenal a guitar player as I've ever heard, but there's only so much I want to listen to without a song, without a singer, without something else there. So that's kind of what had happened to FM radio, which was now taking over. And when Jim and I sat and talked about forming a band, I said I wanted to be the exact opposite of whatever we hear on the radio today. No extended. I actually made posters and put them in these hullabaloo clubs that we were going to be playing weeks before we played our first gig. And the poster said something like, when you come to see Raspberries, here's what you can expect not to see and hear. And then it had a whole list of things, long, boring, extended guitar solos, long, boring, extended drum solos, beards down to our waist, hair down to our waist, torn jeans. These are the things you will not experience. And at the very bottom it says, here's what you will get. Concise, 3.5-minute, great rock and roll songs. Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Elvis, Beatles, Stones. That's it. And the Who. And that was going to be our calling card. And when Jim and I started auditioning other people, eventually Wally came in, and we made him get his hair cut twice. He hated that. But he said, "No, I'm sorry, shoulder length is okay. Below your shoulders, no, not so much." because we don't want to look like every other band out there. I had grown up watching all my favorite British bands, the Small Faces and the Who and the Beatles, and they were as much about style and image as they were about the substance of their music. It was a whole package, and that's what I wanted Raspberries to be, the whole package. And that's what we started out attempting to do, and that's how it came to be.
1, 2, 3, 4.
The Raspberries, and tonight on Retro Radio on 88.7 WJCU and worldwide on the web too at WJCU.org. I am Jumpin Joe Madigan, and joining me today on the Retro Radio hotline is Eric Carmen. And since we're on the topic of the Raspberries are described as power pop. Who came up with that phrase, and was it ever used previously?
I believe the phrase was coined by Pete Townsend to describe the music of The Who. And I think that's the first place that I ever saw it. And we didn't, somebody asked me if the other day if I had set out to play power pop music, and I said, that phrase really, there was no genre called power pop when we started. It was just a term that Pete Townsend, a phrase that he had said. Later on, it became, after Raspberries and Badfinger and Big Star and a few other bands, that harkened back to a time when there was more music, more melody, less soloing, less diddling around on flutes and organs and whatever. And this genre sort of happened. Somebody coined it, and that's how it came about. But the word pop is simply short for popular. And as I said to somebody at some point, pop music, which should be popular music. Well, no one sets out to write or record unpopular music. So pop has never been a dirty word to me. The Beatles were a pop band. I don't know how you can... even the Who are a pop band for the most part. They're a rock pop band, but and a powerful one. But they were writing hits, and that's what we wanted to do. So it's funny to now be within people calling the Raspberries the forefathers or the godfathers of power pop, and we didn't have any idea that we were creating a genre at the time. We were just simply trying to do exactly the opposite of progressive rock, which we hated, and return. We were actually kind of, people saw us as a very retro band at the time, but a few years later, we got all these bands that, like the Cars and Blondie and whatever, and I think we were actually way ahead of our time because everything kind of returned. The whole punk era was moving in that direction. Steve Jones from the Sex Pistols has a radio show out in Los Angeles, and when we were doing our little Raspberries reunion tour in 2005, we did his show, and Steve was telling me how he was like a huge fan of the Side 3 album. He said, sitting on the bed in his bedroom with one of the other guys from the Sex Pistols, and they were playing Tonight over and over again, and he was gone. And I think the quote is in the album, and he says, we were listening to it, and we thought, yeah, they remind us of the Small Faces, but they're better than the Small Faces. It was like, how cool is that? And here this guy is like the guitar player of the nastiest punk band ever. It was cool stuff.
Let's hear some of that power pop.
Be with you.
This is Retro Radio on 88.7 WJCU and worldwide on the web too at WJCU.org. That's the Raspberries and I Wanna Be With You, and it's featured on the new compilation CD, The Essential Eric Carmen. I'm Jumpin Joe Madigan, and Eric Carmen joins me on the Retro Radio Hotline. What song are you most proud of from your days with the Raspberries? Do you have a favorite?
Well, it's pretty hard to ever pick. I guess I would have to pick three. Go All the Way, simply because it was, my first hit. It was a song that confirmed that I could do it. I thought I could do it before that. When that song went top 5, it confirmed in my head, yes, I can do this. I can conquer this field. And also, I love the way it was constructed and the idea behind all of it. I mean, I remember the band being so confused when I tried to explain it to them the first time. And I said, well, so here, it's going to start out, and it's like The Who are playing the intro, and then it hits the verse, and it's suddenly the Beach Boys are now playing the instrumental Don't Worry Baby, and McCartney is singing lead, and then when you get to the chorus, the Left Bank come in singing background vocals, and then we get back to the bridge, and it's The Who again, but with Steve Marriott wailing over the top, and they were looking at me like, are you nuts? They just really had never thought about anything like this, and I actually think that the whole band didn't even really get it until we actually heard it finished in the studio. That was the first time that the band went, oh, I see. Yeah. So Go All the Way would be one. The germ of the idea of Go All the Way was born one night when I was watching the Ed Sullivan Show and the Rolling Stones were on. And Ed Sullivan had made them change the lyric of Let's Spend the Night Together to Let's Spend Some Time Together, because the Stones were dangerous and threatening, and Ed was a pretty conservative guy, and I just remember watching them playing Let's Spend Some Time Together, and every time Mick had to sing that line, he'd roll his eyes, he's really trying to telegraph the audience how stupid he thought that was. And at the same time that I saw this, I was listening to Pet Sounds, and I was thinking, Brian Wilson's getting away with some pretty suggestive stuff here and there. But nobody's paying attention because the Beach Boys aren't threatening and dangerous, and they sing like choir boys. And so, if I want to get something through, the censors, I'm going to have to do it in a certain kind of way that maybe they just don't pick up on it. And that was kind of the seed of Go All the Way, is that when I wrote it, I actually put the words in the girl's mouth. I turned it around. Instead of the guy singing Let's Go All the Way, it's like the girl says it to him. And we sang it like choir boys, and it worked. So that was fun to have that one become a hit. The song that I think rocks the most, that if I had to pick one that I think really sounds the way the band sounded live, was Tonight. I just love that record. I love Jim Bonfanti's drumming on it. I love Wally's guitar playing. It came out really the way it was supposed to. And then Overnight Sensation, which actually was called Hit Record when I wrote it. And the record label made me change the title because they thought Hit Record was too pretentious. And so they made me change it to the much less pretentious Overnight Sensation. And I insisted that they put Hit Record in parentheses afterwards because that was really what the song was about. Those three would probably be my favorites.
Going back to Go All the Way, from what I understand, the BBC banned it.
Yep.
So it didn't get through to everyone.
Nope. I figured when I wrote it, one of two things would happen. It would either get banned, in which case the controversy might encourage some album sales. Or if we got it through and it got played, I figured it's going to be a hit just based on the title. And in America, that worked, and in Britain, they banned it. Go figure.
That's the Raspberries and their biggest hit, Go All the Way. I'm Jumpin Joe Madigan with you today for this special edition of Retro Radio as Eric Carmen joins us on the Retro Radio Hotline. I think one of the best rockin' songs the Raspberries ever released failed to chart nationally, and that's Ecstasy. How is that not a hit? Was that song also banned?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that was really nearly as suggestive as Go All the Way. Certainly not the title. I don't, honestly, once again, I think what happened is there's an odd thing that happens in the music business within record labels, and it happened to me twice, both at Capitol and at Arista. The Raspberries' first hit, Go All the Way, goes gold, sells 1,200,000 copies, becomes top 5 record. Every DJ in the summer of 1972 opened his show blasting that record. And the thinking at record labels after that is, well, the next single is a given. We don't really have to promote it as hard because it's an automatic after coming off a single like Go All the Way that the next one is going to instantly get played. So they don't promote it as hard. And I Want to Be With You became a hit, but not as big a hit. And I think it's because they pulled promotion money back. Well, so I Want to Be With You goes top 10 or something, and now they start to think, well, geez, I don't know, it didn't do as well as the first one. So the next single, Let's Pretend, they spend less money. We're not sure about this one. And so that one only goes top 20. Now they're worried. We do the third album, and they spend even less money promoting because they're concerned that they're throwing money away. So Tonight only makes top 40 or something, and it continues to spiral down. And the less money they spend on promotion, the worse the songs do on the charts. And eventually it gets to the point where, there are no hits happening here. And the exact same thing happened at Arista. All By Myself was my first release, monster hit all over the world. And so, Never Gonna Fall in Love Again's a given. And it, made the top 10 or whatever, but didn't go to number 2 or number 1. And, the same exact little parallel happened. And then by the time we got to the Votes Against the Current album, Clive and I began to have some disagreements about how things should be done. Mr. Davis is a phenomenal record executive and an icon in his own right. And he's got very strong opinions, as Kelly Clarkson will attest. But at the same time, as an artist, you don't always believe that he's right. He may make a suggestion that you don't care for. And if you fight with Clive, you usually lose because he's got a whole label full of artists and lots of careers, and you've only got one. And so, Clive will teach you a lesson if you argue with him. So that's kind of what happened. And each subsequent record, I think, that he had less to do with. Clive loves to be involved. And when he didn't have a lot of involvement, he promoted them less. And there's a live track of That's Rock and Roll. It was recorded in 1976 at the Bottom Line in New York. It was simulcast over, I think, WNEW in New York, the whole concert when I played it. And That's Rock and Roll was the encore. And that track, Tim Smith found this tape somewhere in England, and went through it, and he called me one day and he said, "Wow, I found a really great take of That's Rock and Roll live." And he sent it along, and I listened to it, and I thought, "Wow, that is pretty cool, considering it's flat right off the board, no effects of any kind, just that's it." But the band is really rocking, and I know in Clive's book, I think he said, and he said to me at some point, once you go pop, you could never go back. And I remember as I got off the stage that night at the bottom line, there was Clive waiting at the bottom of the stairs. He had his arm around me. And when I hear that track, that take of That's Rock and Roll, and think we had just played that, how could he have made that statement? Because it rocks. Band sounds like the Rolling Stones, But Clive has these rules in his head, and that's his take. Is that you don't confuse people at record labels. You become known as something, and After All by Myself and Never Gonna Fall in Love Again, and the other two the first three big hits that Arista had were Mandy by Barry Manilow, I think Midnight Blue by Melissa Manchester, and All by Myself. And at that point, Arista starts to be pegged as a ballad label. And when promotion guys walk into radio stations, that's what radio stations are expecting to get. And if they like that sort of thing, great. But, I was always envious of Billy Joel, who was my contemporary, and we had the same agent, and he was over at Columbia. And for some reason, Columbia didn't have that once you go pop, you can never go back rule, because Billy got to release Just the Way You Are and follow it with You May Be Right. So that's what creates a career. Unfortunately, I didn't get to do that.
Eric Carmen joins us on Retro Radio on WJCU, University Heights. Let's hear that live version of That's Rock and Roll from the Bottom Line in New York City from 1976. That's Eric Carmen live at the Bottom Line in New York City from April 3rd, 1976 with That's Rock and Roll. And that particular recording is available for the first time ever on the Essential Eric Carmen CD. I'm Jumpin Joe Madigan, and Eric Carmen joins me on the Retro Radio Hotline. And I wanted to ask you about the remastering of a lot of the songs here on this album. What was involved with the remastering process?
What the remastering process really was is, thanks to Mark and his stellar ears, a matter of listening to what was on the original, flat two-track masters and saying, hey, we now have the technology to make up for the sins of 1975 and 1968 and producers who didn't hear all those frequencies. And so, Mark could add things in. And I think the net result is that, prior to this particular project, I had seen and heard numerous compilations from Capitol and from Arista, and they all said, digitally remastered. And I honestly don't even know what that means in terms of those records, because I would hear maybe a 1% difference, and maybe it's a little bit clearer. But on this record, there are certain songs that took like a 200% turn for the better. Particularly some of the things on my first solo album. My Girl and Last Night were two songs I had very high hopes for when I walked into the studio, and unfortunately I heard them quite differently than my producer did. And I would have sworn that My Girl was going to be the first single from that album. And unfortunately it just kind of turned out to be, it was okay, but once again, kind of thin and small and just not the way got big and rich and crystal high end and big low bottom end and whatever. And Mark Wilder was able to inject that back into it. And the first time I listened to the reference discs in my car, I just sat there with a smile on my face when I heard My Girl. It was like, thank you, Mark. That's the record I wanted back in 1975.
You can hear the Pet Sounds influence on that record. Eric Carmen and My Girl on Retro Radio on 88.7 WJCU and worldwide on the web too at WJCU.org. I'm Jumpin Joe Madigan, and Eric Carmen joins me on the Retro Radio hotline today, and you have a new song out. It's available on the new compilation CD, The Essential Eric Carmen. It's your first new song in over 15 years. It's called Brand New Year. What's the story behind that song?
Well, as I worked with Tim Smith on putting together and working on making this new Essential collection as terrific as we could, at some point, Tim said, this is going to be so cool that we start this with Get the Message. And it would be really cool if you're so inclined to, if you wrote something new to kind of bookend this whole thing, this 45 years of, recording. And I hadn't actually tried, sat down and tried to write anything in a long time. But I said, well, I could certainly think about it. And so the story behind the song is that back in, November, I think, of 2013, we had our first big, heavy snow, the kind of the one that pulled all the trees down and bent all the branches. And where I live, immediately the power went out. And so I ended up, there was no heat, no electricity, no internet, nothing. And so I ended up sitting in the living room where I normally would not be, next to a great big roaring fire, and reading a book by flashlight, because there was nothing else to do. And at some moment in time, I kind of glanced over my shoulder, and there was my piano sitting there. And I put the book down, and I walked over to the piano, and I just kind of put my fingers on the keys and began to play, and out came that kind of rolling intro of Brand New Year. And I thought, this is kind of cool. Tim and I had discussed, he said, what would you write? And I said, well, I don't know exactly what I would write, but I know what I won't write. I won't write anything that resembles Go All the Way, and I won't write anything that resembles All by Myself, because I don't want anybody to hear something new from me and say, he's just rehashing stuff he already did. I want to write something completely different. And as I began writing Brand New Year, I found myself writing in a key signature, a time signature that I don't think I've ever written a song in 6/8 or 12/8 time. It's an unusual time signature for pop music. There are songs, that are written in that time, but most songs are in 4/4. But this one just kind of felt really nice that it was in this, rolling 6/8 or 12/8 time signature. And by the time I had been at the piano for about an hour or so, I had written the music for the verse and the B section and the chorus. And I thought, that's pretty good, I think. And a few days later, I got the inspiration for the lyric, as we were heading toward New Year's Eve. There are two women that I know that have really had horrific years. This had terrible years in 2013. As bad as anything I can imagine. And So, hence the first line, it's been a long, hard year. And as I thought about it, I thought about how many other people there are all over the world that have had years every bit as bad, and maybe worse. And that probably encompasses a lot of people. And one of the things that I try to think about as a songwriter, and if you're very lucky, you get to find some thought that I call the universal, a sentiment or a thought or an emotion that everybody understands. And that's what I was going for, just thinking about the number of people who could relate to that line. It's been a long, hard year, and who had really tough years. Everyone who got divorced, or God knows the people who live in countries that are at war, and people who are starving, and subject, the people who've lived through catastrophic weather events and whatever. There's a lot of people here, and when it got to the chorus, the whole idea of drink a toast to all the ghosts we leave behind us. It's a fresh new start full of promise. That's what brought us here. It's a brand new year, just a little hope for the future, which is what I think it happens every New Year's Eve. People raise their glass and they say goodbye to the old year, and let's hope the next one's better. And that was kind of the genesis of the whole thing.
Available on the compilation, The Essential Eric Carmen. This is his brand new song. It's called Brand New Year. That's Eric Carmen and his first new song in over 15 years. It's called Brand New Year. And Eric, I gotta ask you, do you have any plans to tour again?
Well, the guys, my friends in Brian's band are gung-ho to do this. And so there has been some talk, and I think we're going to, as these next months roll by and we see how the Essential, what kind of ripples it might make, there's certainly a possibility that could happen, because I actually love working with Jeff Usket and Darian Satnaja and Nikki Wolusco and Mikey D'Amico on Brand New Year. They're kind of my dream band. They're an incredibly, incredibly talented bunch of guys. And I've known most of them since the early 90s. And it was the first chance that we'd had to work together. And it was just so much fun and so great. Very inspiring for me to sing with guys that sing that well and play that well. And it was the thought of touring with them is pretty darn attractive. So we'll see what happens. We're going to start putting little feelers out there and see if it's financially doable, and because it's a pretty big undertaking, and it's by the time you end up, getting a front of house sound man and a monitor mixer and a lighting tech and a road crew and the trucks and rehearsing and paying the guys in the band and paying an agent and all the other things, it takes a bit of money to mount one of these things, and particularly when, in my case, I really haven't toured since, I don't know, I was out with Ringo for a couple of months in 2000, and that's pretty much the last of the touring that I did, other than the Raspberries reunion shows, which I think we did about 15 of those, and last one was in 2007. So I think it might be, we have to find out if promoters can figure out a way to affix a number to me, like how much they think they can afford to pay me and not lose their shirt. And that will determine whether or not I can really put together the right kind of band. And the only way I would do it is if I can do it in had this caveat with the Raspberries too, because there had been talk about, getting back together and doing something for years. And I said, well, the one thing I won't do is go out there and suck. It's just, toward the end of the Raspberries' initial, fling back in 1974 or 1975, when we had a manager who basically would just book us into any place, some converted bowling alley, for $750 with a terrible sound system, and there's just no way you can win under those circumstances, and I said, there's a certain mythology that's grown up around the band, and the last thing I ever would want to do is put the band on the stage and burst somebody's bubble, and have them walk out of the show and say, "Oh, they weren't that great," or "Yeah, the records are better." So that was my caveat then, and it stands for me as well. The only way I would do it is if it can be absolutely great and people walk out flabbergasted rather than disappointed. So we'll see if we can make that work.
And hopefully I'll be announcing soon a concert date here in Cleveland.
Cool.
That would be great.
It could happen.
Eric, thank you very much for your time today. I greatly appreciate it, and your stories as well. It's been terrific. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Joe.
Keep on trucking. Wixie 1260.
Friends, I gotta get the heck out of here because the Outspoken Cyclist is on deck next on 88.7 WJCU. Friends, I gotta thank Eric Carmen for his time this afternoon on Retro Radio. I greatly appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed it too. Until next Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock, I am Jumpin Joe Madigan. Goodbye for now.